As role-playing games established a foothold in the Japanese gaming industry throughout the mid-1980s, there was a clear trail of inspiration and succession. The earliest pioneers had played imports of either Ultima or Wizardry, and the creators behind NX's Dragon Quest had even drawn from both games. But instead of being a mere imitation, Dragon Quest became the original template for Japanese role-playing games, and as that series began to take off, it inspired another wave of developers. These developers sought to incorporate what they enjoyed about all the aforementioned games, while trying to make their own stamp on this emerging genre. One of those developers was Atlus, and their debut role-playing game sought to challenge the fledgling genre's dependence on predominantly Western fantasy material. This is the complete history of digital devil story Megami Tensei. Role-playing games imported from the West had caused a minor cultural phenomenon in Japan. Ultima and Wizardry were part of this, but also Dungeons & Dragons, after the first edition was officially localized into Japanese in 1985. Game developers were intrigued by the concept of trekking through dungeons and getting stronger, one battle at a time. But they weren't the only types of creatives being inspired. People in other fields were also taking note, and one of them was a young, aspiring writer by the name of Aya Nishitani. Nishitani had been fascinated by astrology as a child, as well as the concepts of Western black magic. He attended middle and high school with Buddhist influences and came to admire some of their principles, such as the concept of reincarnation. Though he went to study economics at Hokkaido University and began his career in a rather mundane position at an electronics manufacturer, he still held tight to his more esoteric interests and sought several creative outlets, including visual arts, and at one point he even aspired to be a rock musician. Nishitani also dabbled in programming and also made and sold an astrology program. It was through writing, though, that Nishitani made a name for himself, and he had Ultima to thank for that. One of Nishitani's friends, called Mr. X, had attended university in America and become friends with the creator of Ultima, Richard Garriott, who was studying at the same university at the same time. When he returned to Japan, Mr. X recommended that Nishitani play Garriott's newest game, Ultima 4, which had just been released on the Apple II in September of 1985. But this wasn't just a random word-of-mouth suggestion. Mr. X believed in Nishitani's talents as a writer, and although he thought his friend would like Ultima 4 as a game, he also felt it would inspire him to write a novel of his own because of the strong concepts in play. Nishitani took the advice and, after exposing himself to Ultima 4, loved it, and just as Mr. X had predicted, he felt compelled to start writing. Nishitani's initial idea was to write short stories based on the premise of what would happen if the world of Ultima was connected with present-day Tokyo. He then started sharing these short stories online via early iterations of bulletin boards, and he quickly attracted a lot of attention, with fellow users encouraging him to have his works published properly. As a result, Nishitani's prose was soon published in SoftBank's OPC magazine, where again he quickly accrued a following. This then enabled him to catch the attention of Takuma Shoten, a historical publishing company in Japan. They produced the entertainment magazine Animage, in which Hayao Miyazaki's manga Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind was serialized. Nausicaa was turned into an animated film in 1984, leading Miyazaki to create Studio Ghibli, and thus Takuma Shoten's cultural cash was rather high at the time. But they also had a heavy presence in the gaming sphere, publishing Famitsu competitor Family Computer magazine, as well as a plethora of popular strategy guides. At this height of their influence, Nishitani brought his work directly to Animage's editorial department, and their editor-in-chief, Toshio Suzuki, saw its potential. In March of 1986, Takuma Shoten then published Nishitani's serialized works as a traditional novel, and after much deliberation they settled on the name, digital devil story Megami Tensei. Nishitani's story not only blended the real-life Japan with Ultima, but the physical and digital worlds as well. Its story revolved around two main themes, the concept of summoning and binding spiritual entities like demons via technology, and the Shinto deities Izanami and Izanagi, who, in Japanese mythology, created the country. Nishitani was fascinated by their tale as a child, as well as those Buddhist tales of reincarnation. and thus he made his teen protagonists the reincarnations of these divine progenitors. Their story was continued in a second novel that followed in October of that same year called Digital Devil Story 2: Warrior of the Demon City. But Suzuki and Tokuma Shoten believed Nishitani's works could be expanded upon even further, and they proposed a multimedia approach which would see the story adapted into two forms. The first was an original video animation, or OVA, and the second was a video game. Comparable to direct-to-video releases in English markets, OVAs were a growing trend in Japan. Typically longer than a televised episode of an anime, yet shorter than a theatrical release. OVAs were produced specifically to release on home video, like VHS tapes. This medium allowed them to animate Digital Devil Story with minimal risk of investment. Meanwhile, video games were quickly proving a lucrative means of leveraging franchise, demonstrated by the success of licensed games on Western properties like Star Wars, or manga properties like Dr. Slump and Fist of the North Star. But even broader concepts applied, as Square had been signed on to produce a video game based on the Birdman Rally Championships before that deal ultimately fell through, and they instead worked on the Death Trap. With the approach decided, Tokuma Shoten began seeking the right partners to bring the novel to life across these two different entertainment mediums. A new studio called Animate Film was tapped up to produce the OVA, and while Nishitani was credited as the original writer, the screenplay was handled by the director, Mizuho Noshikubo. The result was a 45-minute animation which was released on the 25th of March 1987, and despite being produced as an OVA, it even had a limited screening in theatres that same week. As for the video game adaptation, Nishitani's friend, Mr. X, once again proved an interesting contact, as he connected him with a prominent person at Nintendo whose name, unfortunately, has never been directly identified. Whoever this individual was, they read Digital Devil Story and saw the potential to adapt it into a video game, and promised Nishitani that they'd discuss the opportunity with their fellow executives. The project was provisionally approved, but due to the nature of the IP, when word reached the board, they voted against pursuing the project any further, as they did not feel the family computer should feature a game with such mature content like sex and violence. This ended up being a little embarrassing for Mr. X's contact, and it's reported that they asked Nishitani to make another story for Nintendo to adapt that was more in line with their brand values. Nishitani, though, was adamant that there should be no compromise on the Megami Tensei story, so the search for a development partner continued. Perhaps because of what had happened with Nintendo, when Tokuma Shoten recommenced their efforts to find a partner, they opted not to put all their eggs in one basket. So instead of seeking out one partner to make a video game adaptation, they sought out multiple. This way, they could try a couple of different genres in the process instead of catering too heavily to one audience. Ultimately, two studios were selected to work on separate games. One was to cater to PC enthusiasts, and the other to home console enthusiasts, and their interpretations of the novel illustrated the fork in the road that role-playing games had encountered. Responsible for the PC version was Telenet Japan. Established in 1983, they had developed a few action games for the MSX and various other PCs. Their biggest credit to date was Valis the Phantasm Soldier, an original action game which was selling moderately well. But for the Famicom version, they decided to collaborate with a small, upstart studio called Atlus. Atlus was established in April of 1986, coincidentally just 1 month after Digital Devil Story's publication. Their founding members had met while working at Tecmo, one of the more established companies in Japan's gaming industry. Chief amongst them was Naoya Harano, who managed Tecmo's arcade centres. Harano was close with employees in other departments and knew some were dissatisfied for various reasons. Sensing an opportunity, he therefore secured funding from one of his contacts in the arcade business and offered his colleagues the chance to strike out and establish their own development studio. Thus, Atlus was founded with the minimum 7 employees required by Japanese law, with Harano serving as the company's president. The team quickly got to work, and between November of 1986 and January of 1987, they released 3 games for the Famicom: Galaxy Odyssey, an original top-down arcade game published by Imagineer, a port of the arcade classic Arkanoid published by Taito, and Labyrinth, an adaptation of the Jim Henson film in the vein of Gauntlet, published by none other than Tokuma Shoten. Nishitani and Harano were also old acquaintances connected through Mr. X. Given the budding connections between the companies, Atlus felt like a natural choice to produce the second adaptation, and they were so eager to make the deal happen that Harano used his contacts at Namco to secure a publishing deal for their adaptation. This then set the stage for the two projects to be developed concurrently, albeit on different systems, and despite being based on the same IP, their paths ended up being very different. Once the deals were signed and production got underway, both Telenet and Atlus laid out their plans. But before this happened, Nishitani also established his own vision for the game, which he had been thinking about for some time. He wanted to create a field RPG that resembled Dragon Quest, but directly tied into plot elements from his novels, and therefore required the player to defeat demons, symbolizing various elements, in order to rescue the heroine. Given how Dragon Quest had taken the industry by storm following its release in 1986, this was a logical approach. But one of Atlus's founders, Koji Okada, had also been ruminating on some ideas for some time, and this new project granted him the opportunity to explore them. Okada had started out at Tecmo's manufacturing department designing chassis for arcade cabinets. While also learning how to use CAD software to make blueprints, Okada had discovered an interest in programming, which led to him buying his own PC, and invariably to Wizardry and Ultima, like so many of his peers. He was so enthused by both games that he began to pitch role-playing game ideas to his superiors at Tecmo during planning meetings. At first, these ideas were shot down because the genre was not established in Japan, and they therefore weren't happy to bankroll such a risky venture. But even as the craze took hold thanks to Dragon Quest, they still continued to shoot down his ideas. Thus, leaving Tecmo to help found Atlus gave Okada the chance to realise his dream. His vision was to make an Ultima-style dungeon crawler for the Famicom, something that had not yet been successfully achieved on the system even by Ultima itself. Okada's idea was all mechanical though, simply exploring a massive dungeon in first person. Thus, this new partnership was a golden opportunity. Using Nishitani's plot and characters could bring Okada's gameplay to life. This approach, however, deviated from what Nishitani himself wanted from the game. But as Atlus was so confident with their approach when he spoke to them, he wanted to see what they could come up with. Telenet, however, took the opposite stance. They had no specific attachment to their own plans and decided to run with Nishitani's. Therefore, from the planning stage, the pair of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei games set out to subvert genre expectations. It meant, even though the shadow of Dragon Quest loomed large, and many companies were already pivoting to imitate them, such as Hudson working on Motomo Taro Densetsu, Peach Boy Legend, Kemco on Indora no Hikari, Hotbots, Hoshi wo Miruhito, and even Square, who had gone through a similar process to Tecmo, constantly rebuffing Hironobu Sakaguchi's pleas to make a role-playing game, softened their stance. Atlus opted to take the road less travelled though. They were going to make something quite unlike Dragon Quest, an Ultima-style dungeon crawler. Only one other company had attempted this feat on that platform, Hummingbird Soft, whose original title, Deep Dungeon, was published by Square in 1986, but for the Famicom Disk System and not the Famicom itself. But even though it saw decent sales, largely due to the medium, their efforts to recreate the classic PC experience on console failed to gain long-term attention from consumers, nor with critics, who compared it unfavourably to Dragon Quest. Atlus was gambling that they wouldn't suffer the same fate. The irony was that by opting to follow Nishitani's vision, Telenet were going to produce something that was more akin to Dragon Quest, except they were going to be releasing it into a market where the audience was supposedly much older and more aligned with the grindier, mature games like original Ultima and Wizardry. That was the beauty of the split publishing approach though, as Tokuma Shoten had, they hoped, hedged their bets. It's just that those bets now had an element of risk, as both developers were creating games for opposing demographics. With their approach given the green light, Atlus resolved to go against the current with their take on Nishitani's world and set about melding their gameplay concept to his fiction. Upon rereading the source material, Okada appreciated that Nishitani had made an unconventional protagonist. This was because the main character, Akemi Nakajima, was the antithesis of the standard game's protagonists at the time. Where the avatars in Dragon Quest, The Legend of Zelda and Ys were inherently good, committing heroic acts of bravery and might, Nakajima was motivated by seeking revenge on his classmates, and devised the Devil Summoning Program, a digital means of calling forth supernatural beings, to enact this revenge. Okada wanted to respect this difference between the source material and the game's competition. but he also recognised that games and novels were polar opposites. One of them was consumed passively, while the other was more interactive, with the player having agency over the story's events. Based on this, Okuda concluded that simply reenacting the novel's plot wouldn't be as stimulating. Thus, the Famicom version of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei pursued an original path in almost every way, as alongside trying to subvert expectations with regards to genre and general design, they also proposed continuing the story where the first two books had left off, making the game a third installment of sorts. The books had seen Nakajima trying to save his classmate Yumiko Shirasagi, first from the demon Loki, then from Set, and the pair discovered that they were both reincarnations of Izanagi and Inazami, from Japan's creation myth. The new scenario was written by Kazunori Suzuki with light input from Nishitani, and he chose to embrace the connection between Nakajima and Yumiko, promoting her from damsel to heroine. Both Loki and Set were brought back for the game, but in service of Lucifer, who, thanks to Nakajima's experiments with the devil summoning program, had created a hellish labyrinth in the mortal world. By using this approach, prior antagonists were reused in a meaningful way, but the plot was also self-sufficient, and Lucifer's labyrinth offered a compelling setting to facilitate everything. And Suzuki was confident that this new scenario was therefore catered to both people who knew the source material and total newcomers. The story was then brought to life visually by two artists. One of them was an animator and illustrator called Hiroyuki Kitazame, who had done illustrations for Nishitani's books, while also being involved in the widely popular Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam anime. Atlus's Minoru Eseki then adapted Kitazune's designs for the main character into sprite form, along with a massive bestiary of over 140 demons, inspired by mythologies from all corners of the globe. Music, meanwhile, was handled by Tsukasa Misuko, one of the founding members of Atlus, who had worked on multiple titles at Tecmo, such as Mighty Bomb Jack. Thanks to an enhanced sound chip Atlus had secured for their cartridge owing to their partnership with Namco, Masuko was able to instill the music with a distortion sound. As a result, the 18-song score featured heavy gothic and rock influences, and this enabled him to create a horror-inspired atmosphere that subverted the typical Famicom soundtracks of the time. Okuda's efforts on the gameplay side then helped to ensure the player's experience was similarly elevated. Like Ultima, Digital Devil Story was designed as a party-based dungeon crawler, where a party of up to 5 characters could explore the maze, fight monsters, and obtain new boons, but only 2 of these characters were available off the bat. Upon starting a new game, Nakajima and Yumiko's stats could also be customized to the player's tastes. Nakajima functioned as a fighter from classic RPGs, able to operate a computer to handle demons, while Yumiko had magic at her disposal and the option to make the party flee combat. To fill out the roster beyond these 2 main protagonists, one of Atlus's founders, Kazutoshi Ueda, gave Okuda the idea for 2 original mechanics. To tie in with the mythos of Nishitani's novels and the concept of summoning demons, Ueda thought the hero should be able to directly negotiate with monsters and potentially convince them to join the party. Akin to Dragon Quest II, battles in Digital Devil Story pitted the player against multiple enemies, but if only one enemy remained, the option to talk to them through Nakajima's computer appeared. Negotiation involved making a series of choices in response to the monster's behaviour, either drawing closer or offering particular items, risking them either going berserk or running away. But if the offers were successful, the monster could join the party's team. This made Digital Devil Story the first role-playing game to allow players to recruit enemies, and in the process help to maintain the book's unheroic perspective, and the theme of binding supernatural beings through the use of technology. Thus, the player could fill the remaining 3 slots in the party with monsters, who, as in the books, were called demons despite being drawn from various mythologies. Negotiation alone was not enough, however. At a certain location in the dungeon, called the Cathedral of Shadow, players could fuse 2 demons together to make a new, stronger demon, an essential mechanic for obtaining the best demons in the game, like Odin. Ueda got the inkling for this idea from the way demons oozed out of the monitors in the books and OVA, wondering what would happen if the ooze rematerialized in a new form. The recruiting and combining of monsters offered a unique twist on Ultima's party development systems and stock role-playing classes, while also honouring the dark tone of Nishitani's novels. Beyond these concepts, Digital Devil Story kept the core gameplay of Ultima, but solved an issue which had briefly given Dragon Quest creators pause: how to convert the complex inputs of a PC game to the Famicom's simple controller. Whereas Dragon Quest adopted a brand new command-based approach to distinguish themselves from Ultima, Digital Devil Story essentially combined the two. The screen's layout took a familiar, windowed approach, showing the party's status at the bottom and the labyrinth near the centre. But they took inspiration from Dragon Quest by offering a vertical menu with the player's possible commands. Instead of a keyboard, players moved using the directional pad when outside of battles or menus, while the A button brought up a cursor and made selections, and the B button closed menus or brought up the map. This mini-map was an innovation in itself, derived from Yumiko's Mappa spell, which charted the immediate surroundings and helped players keep their bearings. At a time when most people playing role-playing games devoutly charted their progress on physical graph paper, this innovation offered a spot of convenience, even if the manual still did advocate for using the old-fashioned approach. These ambitions were very forward-thinking, but due to the lack of experience working with this genre and the hardware, it started to cause problems the deeper they got into development. One of the main points of contention related to the Famicom's capacity. Given their heavy background in arcade games while working at Tecmo, it was a particularly irksome problem. In the past, if they'd run into memory issues, they could just add more to the arcade board when they ran out. But that wasn't so simple with Famicom cartridges, which had much stricter limits, and those limits were tightly controlled by Nintendo and also had pretty significant cost implications. As such, as development continued, they realised the original plan for the dungeon, which Okuda estimated could take 50 hours to explore, was scaled back dramatically. A plethora of additional events that had been planned to flesh the story out were also cut, as were other elements they hoped would help to keep gameplay feeling varied, such as additional traps and hazards. Ultimately, about half of the planned content needed to be removed, but even still, the final version of the game ended up being quite massive, and by the end of production, the team were very proud on many levels of what they had accomplished. As Atlus and Namco prepared to launch Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, confusion started to emerge amongst consumers, because Telenet had already launched their game in July of 1987 on the PC-88 and MSX, and not only did it have exactly the same name, it was nothing like the game Atlus were trying to promote themselves. Though they had proposed using Nishitani's game concept for a field RPG, the final product Telenet launched deviated quite a bit in terms of gameplay. And whereas Atlus had gone the route of continuing the story, Telenet offered an alternate version of events from the original book, where Loki crystallized Yumiko and sent her to Set in the Demon World. To save her, Nakajima then ventured to the Demon World himself, in an action-adventure game far more reminiscent of Gauntlet than Dragon Quest. Nishitani's concept of defeating various elemental guardian demons to progress was honoured though, as the Demon World mirrored the shape of the Tree of Life from the Kabbalah, with bosses to be fought on each node, offering various rewards. But despite being a sprawling, open-ended adventure with simple cutscenes, it only had a modest showing with critics and consumers. It lasted just 4 months on Login Magazine's charts, peaking at number 8, as even the unique trappings borrowed by Nishitani's books didn't help it stand out. There were just too many similar games available on that platform releasing at around the same time. To try and bolster long-term sales, Telenet continued to port their version of Digital Devil Story to additional PC platforms over the coming months, but this is where they started to step on Atlus's toes even more, as both Telenet's FM77 port and Atlus's Famicom game were both dated to release in September. This caused confusion for consumers and avid magazine readers who had already seen a different Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei advertised for months. Perhaps to get ahead of this, Atlus and Namco previewed the Famicom game early, showing it off in Famitsu in their July issue, and during the launch window of Telenet's game. Famitsu writers were excited to see the property adapted into a game and teased the unique monster recruitment features. They later scored it as a 31 out of 40 in their October issue, with all 4 reviewers praising its fusion system for setting it apart from similar dungeon games. One even credited this aspect for saving it from becoming too depressing of a game. But in the same issue, Hudson's Momotaro Densetsu was also reviewed, and it stole some of the thunder by receiving a slightly higher score of 32 out of 40. Momotaro Densetsu was a safer, Dragon Quest-inspired role-playing game, drawing upon specific Japanese folklore, and the staff made it their pick of the week, while admitting that either game would be a good buy. A modest ad campaign for Atlus's game then relied on Kitazume's artwork of the main characters from the OVA and the novel, and played up the spooky nature of the scenario. One brief commercial showed employees of Namco's call center being so creeped out by the game that they jumped up and ran away whenever their phones rang. There was also an effort to market the game's music. The November 1987 issue of Beat magazine included a disc with 3 rearranged songs, including the closing credits, Recollections. Following its launch on the 11th of September 1987, Digital Devil Story debuted at number 2 on Famitsu's Top 30 chart, second only to Momotaro Densetsu. But Hudson's competitor had more staying power, retaining its position in the top 5 for the rest of the year, while Atlus's title slipped and fought to even stay in the top 30. This fall was further cemented by the launch of a port of Ultima 3 releasing shortly after. And then 2 other big competitors arrived in the original Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest III. Nonetheless, the game achieved modest sales, with 69,000 copies sold during its first 2-week reporting period and another 59,000 sold in the next. It was only in the third reporting period that things started to slow down significantly, as only 14,000 copies were sold. Regardless, on the list of best-selling Famicom games released in 1987, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei ranked 14th, having sold 142,000 copies before the end of the year. Though this positioned the game as a success, that success proved somewhat bittersweet for Atlus. Due to how fresh they were on the scene, they had relied on Namco via their Namco publishing brand. This had granted them access to better resources and technology, such as sophisticated sound chips on their cartridges, but this also meant royalties went to Nintendo, Namco, and Takuma Shoten. Atlus was still a fledgling company, and they relied on personal connections to help secure deals and funding. But given how well the game had performed, they were excited about their future in the industry and were keen to continue their momentum. Despite being a modest hit, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei was never officially released in English. It suffered the same fate as many other role-playing games released around the time, as few publishers had the infrastructure to A. oversee distribution overseas, and B. undertake the lengthy localization process required for a game that featured so much text. Both Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest had been prioritized by Nintendo due to their impact in Japan, but the other factor at play was the game's darker tone. Nintendo Japan had already rejected the idea of associating themselves in an official capacity, and Nintendo of America had an even stricter stance on using religious iconography. The only option was therefore Namco, who had localized quite a few games themselves, but they also seemingly had no appetite to undertake such a task. It meant Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei remained locked to Japan, and for the rest of the Famicom's lifecycle, it remained sort of a cult title before becoming attached to the hip to its sequel. The soundtracks for both games were released in 1991 as a joint 2-disc album, one disc featuring the game's original audio and the second featuring rearrangements. This aspect remained one of Digital Devil Story's biggest legacies, and in 2023, Masako launched a Kickstarter campaign to revive the score, further rearranging a selection of songs from both games and fulfilling his dream by adding vocals to their closing themes. Atlus later followed in the shoes of Dragon Quest and Ys, as in 1995, they recreated the original Digital Devil Story duology for Super Famicom, releasing them as Kyoyaku Megami Tensei or Megami Tensei Old Testament. But despite the overhauled graphics, the seed of the franchise was outshone by its successors, as by this point, Shin Megami Tensei had come into existence. It meant this revised version of the original 2 games only managed to sell 32,000 copies. Meanwhile, Telenet's version faded into obscurity, mostly seen as a footnote to the success of Atlus's series, although it was ported once in 2006 as part of a 16-game PC-88 collection. Ultimately, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei offered a unique counterculture spin on role-playing games, forsaking many conventions that had already taken root in the popular new genre. Unbeknownst to any of the creators at the time though, they had begun to blaze a unique path for themselves, and that path would begin to be realised with what Atlus did next. With that though, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Darryl, and together with Chris, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of the original Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving us a like. We're still a new channel, so any interactions you make really help us out. We're also very grateful for the support we've received on Patreon, including from Nate Dogg, who is a legendary scholar. Patreon supporters get access to history videos like this one a week early. So if you sign up now, you'll soon be able to get access to the next episode in this series, which is focused on the original Phantasy Star, as well as a full-length bonus episode that's Patreon exclusive, all about Hydralight. You can check out more at patreon.com/datalog. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.